Hello, I'm Verona.
Hi, I'm DeLeon.
We're the Ancestral Voices directors. Thank you so much for joining us on our home studies course. Today is day one of a 5-day video program, and we're just going to have a quick introduction into who we are and explaining why the Ancestral Voices platform even exists. So Ancestral Voices basically came about on the back of our own spiritual journeys as we started to question and research the area of African spirituality. One of the main things that stood out to us is that all the information we came into contradicted all the negativity we had previously been taught on the subject. So what we felt necessary was to try to readdress the balance of the negativity that's out there. We also noted that there's a lack of information available in academia on the topic as well. So our aim to create Ancestral Voices was to allow a platform that was free from colonial and religious propaganda for an open, honest discourse to take place on the subject of African spirituality.
So, following our conversations and our subsequent understandings, we worked pretty much under the mantra as espoused by the late Dr. John Henry Clark, which is that you take the best of what you're good at and use it to help your people. So Verona's background is in video production and mine is in education and the creative fields, mainly of design. And we decided to create our first educational learning resource about African spirituality. And this was the film Ancestral Voices, Esoteric African Knowledge. This involved travels to Ghana as well as Egypt, where we did some research. We interviewed traditional priests, shaman, traditional priestesses as well, from be it the Akan system, the Gan system, and also we went for some field research in what we now modern day call Egypt. And then what Ancestral Voices, Esoteric African Knowledge seeks to do is it opens up this conversation about why even in our modern day times, we still think of and refer to African spirituality as a negative and backward practice. Because what we did, we used comparative analysis to compare ideas that we find in mainstream religions that are also found in African spiritual traditions, to show the large degree of overlap that exists between these systems. Because then it posed the question that if they are so similar, what can we use to still justify this position that African spirituality is something that's negative and to be discarded? Okay, so that was our first learning resource. 7 years later, we would release Ancestral Voices, Spirit is Eternal. Ancestral Voices, Spirit is Eternal, the film, also came with a book that we published, also by the same name, of our research findings. And it's basically a systematic exploration of various African spiritual systems, going back from ancient times. So looking at the practices and the philosophies and the cosmologies of the ancient Kemethians in the place we call modern day Egypt today, and looking at how these pretty much were found exactly the same in traditional systems such as Ifa of the Yoruba people, the Akan system in Ghana, and the Zulu in Southern Africa, as well as the diasporic expressions that we find in places such as Haiti, where we have Haitian Vodou, Brazil, where you have Candomblé, Umbanda, among a few other African-derived traditions. And also in Cuba with Santeria, Lukumi, and Payo Mayombe. So what we did with Ancestral Voices, Spirit is Eternal is to look at all these systems together as different expressions which all originate from the same source. Following Ancestral Voices, Spirit is Eternal, and with still the intention of, as much as possible, getting accurate information about this topic out there, we created an online educational series called Living an African Spiritual Centered Life, which we host on the Teachable platform. And what living an African spiritual centered life is about, basically, is a series of courses which disseminate further information for those who want to cultivate and live a life that is guided by African spiritual philosophies, cosmologies, and practices. So that's the extension that we added to the Ancestral Voices brand, to be able to reach a wider breadth of people and to ensure that accurate information can be accessed now on the topic.
Okay, so here's my spiritual journey. I grew up in a Jamaican household. We were officially Christian. That's what we all went by. That's what we acknowledged. We had the Jesus picture on the wall and everything, but we didn't go to church. In my family, we only went to church for like funerals, marriages, things like that. I didn't actually have that sort of relationship where every Sunday I had to go to church. And so I guess you could argue it was quite a liberal experience in the sense that I wasn't raised with any sort of strong biblical teachings. However, I was aware of, the Bible and the various stories in there. But growing up, it didn't really resonate with me. I mean, I remember from a young age asking a lot of questions, why is God in the Bible kind of so vengeful, and why are there chosen people? If God created everybody, then why are certain people treated better and all that kind of stuff? It just, personally, that didn't resonate with me. So I remember never really feeling like that was for me. I remember when I was younger, growing up, and my parents would talk about being back home in Jamaica, and they'll talk about stories of OBR and how it's so bad and putting curses on people and people's heads swelling up big. And so whenever they spoke about these traditions at home, it was always spoken about in a negative way. So they would tell stories of things that they've heard that happened in the village or something, but they always spoke about it as something negative. They never really acknowledge it as, say, that this is our spiritual traditions, this is what we've carried down. It was always spoken about in a negative light, as something to be scared of. But I remember at being that young age, just being really fascinated by these stories because it really captured my attention. But what I also noticed is because they were fearful when speaking about it, it also showed that, okay, these are my parents, these are grown people, and they're scared of this stuff. So even at that point in my life, I realized there's power in these teachings, and they knew it too, but they just been taught to be scared of it. So that was kind of my introduction at a young age to the topic, but it was never something I really followed up again until I became much older. And as I got older, I remember I went through a phase where I didn't believe in anything. I literally shut down all forms of religion and spirituality, and that went on for quite a while. And it was only until around 2001 where I would say that was kind of my own personal spiritual awakening time. At that point, I had my first sort of, how would you say, spiritual / psychic experience. It was also the year that my father passed. And for a lot of people, when a parent or a significant elder in their life dies, that does seem to trigger like a spiritual awakening for a lot of people. And in my case, my dad was ill for a very long time. He was ill for about 11 years before he actually passed. But a few months before he did, I was actually getting strong emotions and feelings about it. Like I could sense that his death was coming. And I remember being on holiday in Jamaica with a friend, and while we were there, her uncle passed and we went to his funeral. And at the funeral, I consciously remembered like seeing my dad there, and it's like I could feel that, that's going to be him, or that is him. And it was such an overwhelming experience to the point where I remember calling my mum back home in England and saying, Mum, is everything okay? Is that all right? She's like, yeah, he's fine. Stop worrying. And I was like, are you sure? You're not trying to lie to me? But there was just this strong sense as it happened, a few months later I came back and he did pass. And what is also significant about that as well is about 4 nights before, I actually dreamt it. And I remember waking up in the morning and saying to my mum, I had a dream that Dad died last night. And she was like, oh, you know, one of the sort of Jamaican tradition type thing. And she was like, oh, you know, don't worry about it. If you have a bad dream and you talk it, it's not going to come true. But in this case, it did. Interesting enough, we never actually realized until about 2 weeks later because everything's going on and obviously you're so overwhelmed. And I said, oh, wow, Mum, I remember I dreamt this. I told you, didn't I? She's like, yeah, you did. So at that point, I think there was just a lot going on, but definitely I felt that something in my own intuition, I think, was starting to kick in there. Prior to that point, I never had any experience with sort of dreams or, you know, notice any sort of high sense of intuition before. 2001 was also the year that I saw my very first psychic. And that was a very good experience because it literally changed my perception of reality. I never really gave thought about the whole concept of a spiritual world before, but that blew it open for me. And so on the back of that, I started to realize that there was a relationship between the physical and the spiritual realm, and that there is something post-death, and that life kind of transforms. Not necessarily the person is alive in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense, that someone can pass over and there's still things going on. It also taught me that there are people who have the ability to see both realms of existence, and so that was just fascinating and opened up my mind. And I have to admit, I did become quite obsessed with seeing these kind of people because I was just curious. I wanted to know more, and so that really opened up my mind to spirituality and how that the human mind, and it opened up my mind to see that as humans, what we're capable of. There's so much more than just this physical realm of existence, and that was definitely brought home through that experience. Another thing that happened that year, 2001 again, was 9/11. And 9/11 was really significant for me. I remember that just watching it at the time, I felt really overwhelmed. It was just like, wow, mind-blowing. It felt like, despite being, you know, news, it felt like watching a Hollywood film or something. And I remember being really mesmerized by it, to the point where it really drew me in, and I became very obsessed with watching the news, following current affairs, and just trying to keep up to date with what's going on in the world. Prior to that, I never really had an interest. But what also came on the back of the 9/11 event was my interest started to begin into conspiracy theories. And so that kind of led me on to the conspiracy movement. And from there, that allowed me to question and open up my own sense of reality, because I was being exposed to all these different types of ideas that I'd never been previously exposed to before. The conspiracy movement also helped me to question reality. So I started to break down everything. It taught me to see beyond what I had been taught and conditioned to believe. So it was a case of literally unlearning and relearning. And so at that point, nothing fazed me. There was nothing that I would take as an absolute truth. It meant that everything could be broken down for questioning, and that was necessary. It was actually through the conspiracy movement that I started to pick up on things like ritual and symbolism. These are things that I weren't aware of before, but throughout that whole movement and learning, I became to recognize and to understand symbolism and ritual when it was being played out. So that was quite a fascinating journey in itself. On the back of the whole conspiracy movement, I came into a lot of spiritual teachings at the same time, because one of the concepts that I learned from there was that through your mind and your ability to think beyond or see beyond this current realm of existence, then a lot of the things won't actually impact you. And that led me to reading a lot of self-help books. It enabled me to start reading a lot more about the self and developing the self. And through that, that led on to New Age teachings. And that introduced me to things like meditation, crystals, what else? Like aromatherapy, incense, tarot, and all that type of world opened up to me, and vision boards, and even ritual. I mean, they never actually referred to it as ritual, but concepts like writing things down that you actually want to manifest in your reality, and having a note and keeping it somewhere and burning it, or whatever you need to do. So they're all concepts that I came into from learning about New Age spirituality. I remember reading a Kabbalion years ago, which is basically the 7 Hermetic principles, which is from Tahuti, aka Thoth, in ancient Kemet, now known as Egypt. And what I found really fascinating with that is these laws, or principles as they're referred to, speak about the universe in such a way that is timeless wisdom. And what blew me away was this is what they were believing way back then. So I'm like, what? This is the kind of teachings that they were coming up with then. So I was like, I'm going to have to really look and learn and study more about ancient cultures, and particularly African cultures, because I felt that it was necessary to start with my own lineage and work from there. And I just was blown away that this is the type of wisdom that was spoken about then. And I'm like, wow. And what also stood out to me, particularly with the whole sort of New Age movement, is that number one, a lot of the information that was coming forward, it wasn't really clear what the original source was. And so that I didn't feel quite comfortable with. And I also felt that Africa as a whole was often missing from that whole narrative. So you'll have information and they'll say, oh, this is from Egypt. But like ignore the rest of the entire continent. I'm like, well, you know, I find it hard to believe that, you know, we're not really going to research and look into what the rest of the continent was doing. So that was something that didn't sit well with me, and I guess that kind of spurred me on to find out, well, if this is what was going on in Egypt, I need to find out what was the wisdom going on in the rest of the continent. What's interesting is 2001 is when I started my actual so-called spiritual journey, but it wasn't until about 2008 that I got into African spirituality. And it's so fascinating how everything is like a step process. And sometimes it takes a while before the dots connect, because even after reading the Kabbalion, it still took me a while before I got to the rest of the continent. So it's funny how things work. But what happened was, I remember getting to a point where I was becoming quite interested in learning about myself, learning about myself and my culture and my history. And from there, I remember listening to a particular radio show, and I was in the radio show chat rooms, and there was a lady in there who was speaking about, she had a dream and they were drumming in the dreams, and she said that the ancestors were talking to her and communicating with her. And I was like, wow, completely blown away. I was like, ancestors? Your ancestors are talking to you? And this is the first person that I'd ever heard speak like this. I was completely blown away by what she was saying. And so I started to engage with her more, and she was saying to me, yes, you know, your ancestors they're always with you. They communicate with you. They can communicate with you through your dreams, through your intuition. They're part of your DNA. You know, they're part of your very genetic makeup. So you're not separate from them. And for us as African people, this is just how we communicate. This is how we are. This is what we do. And I was like, wow. But, you know, what she said to me, even though at the time it was mind-blowing, it resonated. And I was like, wow, you know, I just want to know more. Like, something in me was just like, I need this information, like, so tell me more. And one of the things she said to me was like, just go call on your ancestors, you know, talk to them, call upon them, invite them into your life. You know, they're there, but you need to actively build that relationship with them. So I was like, ooh, okay. So I remember going home And I don't remember at what point in time this happened, but I remember saying, this is something I want to do. This is something I need to do. And I remember like getting a candle and calling on my ancestors and just saying, look, you know, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean to neglect you all this time, but I humbly ask that you come into my life and help me and guide me along my journey. And I'm not sure at what point afterwards, but I couldn't give you a time reference, but soon afterwards, I started to notice that I kept seeing the number 11 everywhere. Like I would see it around 6-7 times a day. Every time I look at the clock, like it was 11 minutes past the hour. So it could be like 10, 11, 11, 11, whatever. I could go outside, see a bus, it's the number 11 bus, like whatever, like everything was the number 11, to the point where I knew I was being communicated with. And I remember telling friends and family at the time, and they were just like, oh my God, she's mad, she's crazy, whatever. But I knew. So I was like, whatever, I don't care what anyone believes me or not. I know what's happening to me. And so I started to even call it ancestor time. Whenever I saw it, I would be like, hi ancestors, thank you. I know that you're here. And I acknowledged that as their way of showing me that we're here, we're listening, we're around you. This is how we're going to communicate. This is how we've got your attention. And what I found quite interesting is once they got my attention and I was able to pick up on that symbolism, then they were able to communicate with me in other forms. So then that's when I started noticing things like animal symbolism. So I'm sure that's probably been going on my whole life, but only through that point where it was I was, you know, triggered or awakened to see with my third eye, so to speak, then I was able to recognize those signs. So that was wonderful. And what came on the back of that is I knew that I needed to take it to the next level. So I remember listening to a blog talk radio show, and there was an interview there, and they were talking about that what we have been taught to fear is ultimately what empowers us. And so they were saying that, you know, things, you watch Hollywood movies and they're like, voodoo is so scary and stay away from that, or, you know, Satanism, witchcraft, blah, blah, blah. All these kind of words, all these symbols that you've been taught to fear. And, you know, he was saying that those things, if you look into them properly and research properly for yourself, you'll find most cases are there and are empowering to you. And so it was really my sort of catalyst to say, okay, I need to just take the plunge and let go of any fear that I've accumulated over the years. Because here I was thinking that, you know, I wasn't really raised hardcore Christian or anything. I'm not scared of these things. But it made me realize how much internal programming I had taken on. And I was scared, you know, even when I did light the candle to the ancestors, I was like, oh my God, I don't know, is something going to jump out at me? You know, I was getting scared. So it just really shows how you internalize fear. But what I came to realize is that I need to take it to the next level. And by the next level for me, that was just to implement ritual into my life. And it's at that point when I knew I was supposed to implement ritual is where I happened to meet DeLeon. And what was interesting to me is prior to this point, I never met people who were interested in this subject. Normally when I had questions about things, I had no one to really bounce off about it because people just thought I was crazy or why are you thinking about these kind of things? But when I met DeLeon, he was already at that stage in his journey where he had already started implementing ritual. And I was like, wow, you're into this too. And not to mention, not only you're into it, but you've also taken it to the next level. And so what he did is he gave me the book of Water and the Spirit by Malidoma Some. And I just thought that was so timely because after reading that book, it really confirmed everything I had felt internally. And also by meeting DeLeon and him showing me that, okay, well, these are the kind of things that I do, it really opened up my realm. And it was almost, and it was confirmation to say, this is your next step. You know, this is how you can start implementing these teachings into your life so it can become a way of living. Once we came together, that's when we started to share stories on our own personal experiences, and that's kind of how Ancestral Voices was born, and that's my spiritual journey, and it's been going on ever since. And it's just been a journey of learning and growing and developing every day. And yeah, it's like whatever you learned or whatever you knew last year, whatever you knew last week, it changes. You know, life is a constant cycle of evolving. And so it's been a very enlightening journey so far.
So my spiritual awakening, if you will, started off in my late teenage years when I completed secondary school, or high school as is known in some other parts of the world. When I completed high school, I had to spend a year at home retaking 2 subjects that I did not do particularly well in. And it was at this period that I started getting the impressions in my mind that I had to start making a connection with the spirit of my grandmother. Now, this was very interesting because we were raised, myself and my siblings, in a very devout Catholic home. My mom was a very devout Catholic, and as a result, that was all that was allowed in the household. Myself, I'm named after my grandmother, so my name is Yao, and her name was Ya because we're both born on a Thursday. So my full Asante or Akan name is Nana Yao Nyako. The Nana denotes that I'm named after my grandmother. Yeah, we share the same name. So fast forward into the period after high school, being at home by myself for most of the time, I started getting these impressions that I needed to make this connection with the spirit of my grandmother. It was very scary and a very difficult period because initially what I got was fear, because in the Catholic tradition and in the Christian one at large, the idea of connecting with a spirit in itself is something that is deemed very evil. It's negative. Yes, it's something that can send you to hell. So I was in a bit of a mental conflict for a long period of time, but then I gave in to my intuition. I gave it into my inner guidance. And I found a day, and I set that day specifically for the day that we both shared, which was on a Thursday. So on a Thursday, I would light a candle, I would put water out, I would sometimes write requests on a sheet of paper, and then I would speak verbally to the spirit of my grandmother. Now, all of this came to me to be done because I didn't have any knowledge of the actual traditional practices for venerating our ancestors. I even ended up often using the Catholic rosary to make some of the prayers, and then I would engage in a natural conversation with the essence of my grandmother. Little would I come to know years later that everything that I was guided to do was actually the right thing to do, that there was no, should we say, set, specific, correct way, but just the way that you get intuited to do so. So I spend many afternoons and evenings channeling and connecting with the spirit of my grandmother. And as a result, you know, I took my exam, I did well enough such that I could move on to the next stage. And this spiritual connection didn't end there because it continued even as I was brought to the UK to further my education. When I was brought to the UK, I was living in a place named Brixton. At the time, it was very famous for crime rates, murders, drugs. It was pretty much a ghetto, if you will. Now it's one of the most gentrified areas in England, but back then in the late 90s, Brixton was pretty much a dump. And this was the context in which I lived. And even in that environment, there were many near escapes, many near death experiences that, you know, living as a young teenager and some of the lifestyles you get into, you know, you could easily end up on a wrong road. But this connection guided me. You know, it would give me premonitions of things not to do, places not to go to. And as a result, you know, I'm still alive having this course that I'm sharing with you. But unfortunately, I have many friends whose lives have not turned out that way. And I know mine, I can only give thanks to spirit. And this is the spirit of my very first ancestor that I'm aware of, which was my great-grandmother. And now this connection to spirit helped me in many other ways as well. You know, for me to be accepted onto a teacher training course in what is now regarded as the best university for teacher education and social research, which is the Institute of Education. I had a dream a few days before I even went for the interview. And in this dream, particular behavior patterns were introduced to my mind to show me how to perform when I went onto the interview itself. And lo and behold, for that particular year, I was the only black male who was accepted on the course. And this was because for all those years since the late 90s, when I started making contact with my the spirit of my grandmother, it had kept me, guided me, and instructed me on how to move forward with my life. So that was really the only instruction manual that I needed. And it benefited me well, and it still benefits me today. Now, when I arrived in the UK, I was in a bit of a dilemma because I was totally disenfranchised with Catholicism and Christianity in general. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So my sense of seeking led me to Islam. And I studied Islam for close to 2 years with a very good friend of mine from the Yemen. And he would, give me books to read, passages to consider, to ponder on. But very quickly, it became clear to me that Islam was just a reinterpretation of Christianity, if you will, with just a few characters changed. So there was nothing really different. It was just a different label with the same old contents. So again, I had to move on because I had a seeking, a spiritual seeking that needed answers. So I then moved on and I joined the West London Buddhist Association to explore Buddhism because I was seeking a connection. And I knew this connection had no conflict with the practices that I was still keeping up every week for the memory of my grandmother. And it's actually while I was at the Buddhist temple when we were introduced to what is known as the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, which are principles for living and behavior that allows one to attain what they call enlightenment, or if you will, your God consciousness, to become the very best that you can be. It's these principles that made me think, wait, hold on a minute, I'm familiar with these principles. And then my mind went back to some of the African proverbs that my late mother and grandmother would use in teaching us about particular ideas, in disciplining us, as well as in general conversation. So in that moment, in that temple, I sat there and I thought to myself, hold on a minute, this sounds so much like African proverbs. So if this is what I'm finding out in Buddhism, but I'm also familiar with it in a context that is not labeled Buddhism, then why don't I start to make a concerted effort to learn about my own heritage and tradition? So Buddhism just basically springboarded me into exploring deeper about African indigenous spiritual systems and cosmologies. Okay, now what was even more interesting is right after that experience, maybe about 2-3 weeks later, that I happened to meet Verona at a mutual friend's barbecue party. And then we got talking and started particularly exploring spirituality in general. And then we started to realize that, hold on a minute, most of these traditions, whether we call them now New Age or the mainstream religions, or even the Eastern philosophies, all seem to have this big overlap with African spirituality. So it gave us the impetus to say, why don't we try and put forth some work that explores this in much more detail. Now, what was really interesting was when I came to the UK and I started college, this was roughly at the age of 19. The first inkling I had, I was doing a media and communications course. The first inkling I had was to do a short film about my Asante spiritual systems. But then being so young and knowing the stigma that was attached to the topic, I was like, there's no way I'm doing it, because that will lead to social ostracization. No one wants to speak to me, because every time you mention this topic, the first thing people tell you is, oh, it's juju. Oh, it's obia. Oh, it's negative. It's not something you want to talk about. It's not something you want to relate to. And then over 12 years later, guess what? It still followed me. Because when I met Verona and we had these conversations, what was given birth to from those conversations was Ancestral Voices as a brand. And what was even more important was this time the brand was much wider than the original conception that had come to me as a student in college. And so that is my spiritual journey as I traced it from my teenage years up until the very moment when I met Verona, who would later become my wife, and our collective efforts that we put together to create this educational resource that is instrumental and very useful for the times that we're living in.
We hope that you've enjoyed day one of the course, and hopefully you have a bit more insight into Ancestral Voices and what we do and who we are as individuals. And hopefully our spiritual journey stories can help you on your own journey. So see you later.
See you soon. And yes, as has already been mentioned by Verona, hope you found the stories inspiring and also something that you can relate to give you some ideas yourself about things that you might be going through and, you know, we're worried about or thinking about, and then realize that you're not alone, and, you know, spirit always connects us. So we look forward to seeing you on the second day of the course. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.